Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. I can't explain what drove me to the Black Hills, not really. After Claire died, I started wandering. I packed up the RV we'd planned to take on a grand tour across the country and hit the road. But it wasn't the adventure we'd talked about, not the journey to reconnect or find peace. Instead, it became an escape, a way to outrun the hollow ache inside me, the guilt, the suffocating silence of our home without her. So, I found myself here, in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota, surrounded by trees that felt older than time itself. I parked the RV in an empty campground miles from the main road. No other campers in sight. Just me, the forest, and my thoughts. Exactly what I thought I needed. I set up camp and did my usual routine. Grabbed my gear, prepared for a hike, and tried not to think about how Claire had always been the one who loved these quiet moments before an adventure. The wind rustled the pines as I headed out. The sky clouded over, casting everything in a gloomy light. The forest was dense, the trails winding and hard to follow. Claire would have loved it here, would have laughed at my grumbling as we tried to navigate the maze of trees. She was always the one with the better sense of direction. But now it was just me, and after hours of hiking, I found myself completely turned around. The compass in my hand spun erratically, the needle pointing in every direction but the one I needed. I cursed under my breath, the light fading faster than I'd expected. I was a seasoned hiker, but this forest felt different. There was a heaviness to the air, something almost oppressive. I decided to head back, retracing my steps the best I could, though the forest seemed to shift with every turn. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun had nearly set. That's when I first saw the deer. It was standing at the edge of the campground just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was a buck, tall, regal, with antlers that seemed to stretch up into the trees. But something about it was off. It was too still. Its eyes locked on me in a way that wasn't quite right. I stared at it for a long moment, but as soon as I took a step toward it, it bolted into the woods, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease creeping into my chest. Just a deer, I muttered to myself. Nothing weird about that. But the feeling didn't leave. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind howling through the pines, like it was whispering something I couldn't quite hear. I chalked it up to exhaustion and headed inside the RV. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to the feeling of something outside. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps circling the RV, but every time I worked up the nerve to check, nothing was there. The second time, just before dawn, I opened the door to find the same deer standing in the clearing, its dark eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't even flinch when I shone the flashlight on it. I watched it for what felt like an eternity, but it didn't budge, didn't blink, just stood there, watching me. I closed the door and tried to sleep, but the sight of those dark, hollow eyes burned into my brain. The next day, I decided to hike again, trying to shake off the strange encounter. The sun was brighter, and the forest didn't seem quite as foreboding, though the unease from the night before still clung to me. As I walked, I tried to focus on the trail, on the sounds of my boots crunching the earth, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Claire. She should have been here. This was her kind of place. Wild, untouched, alive in a way that made the world outside seem distant. As I climbed a ridge, something caught my eye. a flash of white in the trees. At first, I thought it was a bird, but then I saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the forest, her back turned to me. She was dressed in white, her long dark hair flowing down her back. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there as still as the deer had been. "Hey!" I called out, but she didn't respond. I quickened my pace, trying to get closer, but by the time I reached the spot where she had been standing, she was gone. No trace of her, no footprints, no sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. Just the wind. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind out here? I'd been so isolated, so wrapped up in my own grief that maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. I told myself it was nothing, just another trick of the forest, maybe another hiker I hadn't noticed earlier. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, as I sat by the fire outside the RV, the forest seemed to close in on me. The wind picked up, rustling the trees in the strange patterns, and once again, I heard something outside. The same footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the RV. I stood, the fire crackling behind me as I stared into the dark, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Then I saw her again, the woman in white standing just beyond the trees, her face partially hidden by the shadows. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood the deer, its eyes reflecting the firelight in an eerie glow. They both stared at me, unmoving, silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step toward them, but just like before, they vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, waiting, listening, expecting them to return, but they didn't. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves shot. I needed to leave, to get out of this place before whatever was out there came for me. But something kept me here. Some part of me couldn't leave, couldn't pull myself away from the forest, from the woman, from the strange feeling that had gripped me since I arrived. It was as if the forest itself had sunk its claws into me, refusing to let me go. On my final day, I decided to hike one last time, determined to shake off the fear and face whatever was haunting me. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, the light dimmer. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading me in circles. My head spun, and I felt like I was being drawn further into the forest, like something was pulling me toward it. And then I saw her again. She was standing on the ridge ahead of me, her figure bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. This time, she didn't vanish. She beckoned me forward, her hand outstretched, her voice soft but clear. "David." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She had said my name. Claire's voice. It was Claire's voice calling me, telling me to come closer. "David, I'm here. Come with me." I took a step forward, my mind racing. It couldn't be her. Claire was gone. But the voice was hers, and I wanted so badly to believe it, to follow her, to find her waiting for me just beyond the trees. But then, something changed. The woman's figure flickered, like a flame about to go out. Her legs bent in unnatural ways, her face twisting into something inhuman. The deer stood beside her now, its eyes locked on me, its body tense as if ready to strike. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The woman's face had twisted into something grotesque, her eyes too dark, too hollow. She wasn't Claire. She was something else, something ancient, something hungry. I turned and ran, the sound of whispers chasing me through the forest, the wind howling through the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the RV, my heart racing, my body shaking. I left the Black Hills the next morning, never looking back. But even as I drove away, the memory of the woman, of the dear woman, lingered. She wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She had been real, and she had almost lured me into the forest, into the same fate that had taken so many others before me. I knew, deep down, that I'd been running not just from her, but from myself, from my grief, from the memories of Claire that haunted me every step of the way. But now, as I drive through the endless stretch of highway, I know one thing for certain. I can't run from it anymore. Because wherever I go, the whispers of the forest and the eyes of the dear woman will follow. I've been living in my RV for the past 3 months, crisscrossing the Southwest in search of, I don't know, solitude, clarity, some kind of peace after the wreckage of my marriage. The open road was supposed to give me that, a chance to get away from it all. From her, from the mistakes, from the feeling that I was the one who had failed. The plan was simple. Drive, stop when the mood struck, and see where the road would take me. But now, sitting here in the eerie, pale expanse of White Sands National Park, I wonder if this isolation was a mistake. The dunes stretched out before me, endless, ghostly waves of white gypsum under the burning New Mexico sun. I parked the RV in a remote campsite, away from the crowds, just as I liked it. The first day had been beautiful. Bright blue skies, a cool breeze, and a sense of vast openness that made me feel small and insignificant in the best way possible. But that night, as the sun began to set, the desert started to feel different. It was like the landscape was changing, becoming something else entirely when the light faded. That's when I met him. I was sitting by the fire, sipping on a beer, trying to lose myself in the flickering flames when I heard footsteps approaching. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a coyote maybe, but then a figure stepped into the circle of light cast by my fire. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that looked like it had seen a few too many sunrises. "Evening," he said, smiling like he wasn't just some stranger walking up to my camp in the middle of nowhere. I nodded, trying to hide my irritation at having my peace disturbed. "Evening." "Mind if I sit?" he asked, already lowering himself onto one of the logs I'd dragged over earlier. "Sure," I muttered, feeling trapped by his sudden presence. He introduced himself as Dale, an RV traveler like me, out exploring the Southwest. At first, I was relieved to have someone to talk to. We swapped stories about our journeys, the roads we'd taken, and the places we'd stayed. Dale was friendly, easygoing, and for a moment, I thought I'd made a new friend. But then, his stories started to take a darker turn. "You ever hear about her?" Dale asked, his voice dropping low as he glanced out toward the dark dunes beyond the campfire's light. "Her?" I raised an eyebrow, not sure where he was going with this. "La Llorona," he said, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The weeping woman. She's been wandering these parts for as long as anyone can remember. You know the legend, right? She lost her children, drowned them in a fit of madness, and now she roams the deserts crying for them. People say if you hear her wails, you better watch out. She'll lure you into the dunes, make you lose your way, and you'll never come back." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Yeah, I've heard the stories. Mexican folklore, right?" Dale nodded, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, like he wasn't just telling me a story. He leaned closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "But here, in White Sands, They say she's different. This place, it's ancient, more than just the desert. The wind here carries voices. If you listen closely, you can hear her." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the sudden tension. "I'll keep an ear out." Dale just smiled and stood, the firelight casting long shadows on his face. "You do that, and be careful. She likes people who are lonely." He turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the flickering fire and the weight of his words hanging in the air. I sat there, staring at the flames, trying to push the uneasy feeling away, but it lingered, like a cold hand gripping my spine. Later, as I lay in the RV, trying to sleep, the desert seemed to come alive around me. The wind picked up, whistling through the dunes, and for a moment I thought I heard something else. A faint sound carried on the breeze. It was soft, like a distant cry. I told myself it was just the wind, that the desert was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I woke up groggy, my sleep disturbed by strange dreams I couldn't remember. I shook it off and decided to spend the day hiking the dunes. The landscape was stunning in its starkness. Rolling white hills, the sky an endless stretch of blue. But the further I walked, the more disconnected I felt. It was as if the desert was too vast, too empty. There was no sound but the crunch of my boots in the sand. No movement but the wind shifting the dunes. By late afternoon, I was starting to regret coming out here. The silence was oppressive and my thoughts kept drifting back to Dale's story. I tried to shake it off, but as I climbed one of the larger dunes, something caught my eye. A figure standing on the crest of the dune in the distance. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was a woman, dressed in white, her long, dark hair flowing in the wind. She was standing still, watching me. For a moment, I thought she might be another hiker, but there was something off about her. Something too still, too distant, like she didn't quite belong here. "Hey!" I called out, waving my hand. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I took a step toward her, but as I did, she vanished, swallowed by the shifting sands. My heart raced, and I scrambled up the dune, hoping to catch another glimpse, but when I reached the top, she was gone. There was no sign of her, no footprints in the sand. Nothing. I stood there, scanning the dunes, but the landscape was empty, silent. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or an illusion caused by the heat. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The woman, La Llorona. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed inside the RV, trying to read, but every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement outside. Shadows flitting just beyond the windows. The wind picked up again, howling through the dunes, and with it came that sound, the faint, sorrowful wail. I tried to sleep, but the wailing wouldn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like it was calling my name. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the panic rising inside me. I told myself it was just the wind, that the desert was playing tricks on my mind, but the sound was too clear, too real. Then the RV door rattled. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The door rattled again, harder this time, like something was trying to get in. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight. I clicked it on, shining it toward the door, but there was nothing there, just the wind howling through the cracks. But the wailing, the crying, it was louder now, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, determined to find the source of the noise, to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The dunes stretched out before me, glowing faintly under the light of the moon. And there, at the edge of the campsite, she stood, La Llorona. She was closer now, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow with grief. Her white dress billowed in the wind, her dark hair tangled around her shoulders. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes, they were locked on me, pleading, accusing. I froze, my legs refusing to move as her wail echoed in the night. It wasn't just a cry, it was a voice, a whisper, and it was saying my name. Ethan. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling into the sand. The wind howled, and the wailing grew louder, like it was coming from all around me. I turned, desperate to get away, but the dunes shifted under my feet, making every step feel like I was sinking into quicksand. Behind me, the wailing grew shriller, closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my legs burning as I climbed the nearest dune. When I reached the top, I collapsed, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The desert was silent again. The wailing had stopped. I looked around, but there was no sign of her. No sign of La Llorona. It was just me, alone in the vast, empty desert. The next morning, I packed up and left White Sands without a second thought. As I drove away, the dunes faded into the distance, and the weight of the night before began to lift. But even now, as I sit in the safety of my RV miles away, I can still hear the faint sound of her wail, carried on the wind. And I know she's still out there, waiting, watching. I've been in the woods for 3 days, and something's wrong. At first, I told myself it was the solitude. I wanted this. I needed this. But now, as I sit by the fire, surrounded by towering trees and the oppressive silence of the forest, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. It's not the good kind of solitude either. The kind that clears your head, that helps you forget the world. No, this is different. It's like the forest is watching me, waiting for something. The air feels heavy, like the trees are holding their breath. I poke at the fire, the embers glowing bright in the cold night air. Dark hollow, they call this part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. The locals warned me not to come here, but I figured it was just old Appalachian superstition. A place like this, so remote, untouched by the modern world, it's perfect for what I wanted. 2 weeks off the grid, just me and nature. No distractions, no reminders of her. I close my eyes and try to block out the memory. Sarah, my little sister. God, I couldn't save her. That's why I'm out here. To prove I can still survive. To prove that I'm not the failure I was on that mountain 3 years ago when I couldn't get to her in time. I still hear her scream sometimes, echoing in my head. She slipped, and I was too slow. I was always too slow. The fire crackles, snapping me out of the past. I get up, feeling the ache in my legs from hiking all day. I look around, scanning the tree line, but there's nothing. Just shadows, the dark reaching in around the light from the fire. But it's quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. Nature shouldn't be this still. My head's probably messing with me. Isolation can do that, I know, but that doesn't explain the silence. I shake it off and step into my RV, locking the door behind me. It's a small thing, but sturdy enough to last a few weeks out here. I left the phone in the cabinet. Haven't touched it. Part of me wonders if maybe I should check it, but I won't. I came out here to leave everything behind. As I lay in my small cot, the uneasiness creeps back in. The air inside the RV feels thick, like the silence is pressing against me. I close my eyes and force myself to breathe slowly, willing sleep to come. I'm drifting off when I hear it. A voice. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable. Ben. My eyes snap open and my heart starts racing. It came from outside, from somewhere deep in the trees. But no one else is out here. No one could be. I sit up, straining to listen, but the voice doesn't come again. My mind has to be playing tricks on me. Sleep deprivation, maybe, or the isolation. That's all it is. Still, I don't move for a long time, just staring at the door, listening to the silence. Eventually, sleep pulls me under, but it's not peaceful. My dreams are thick with memories of Sarah, her laughter, her bright eyes, then her scream, her fall. The next morning, I wake up feeling like I've barely slept. The sun is barely cresting over the horizon as I stumble out of the RV, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The air is cold, too cold for early fall. I can see my breath, little clouds of it drifting up into the still air. Something feels different. I walk around the RV, stretching out the soreness in my limbs when I notice the footprints. They circle the RV in erratic, uneven patterns. At first, I think maybe they're mine, but they're too large. Definitely not human. And the strangest part is, they weren't here yesterday. My blood runs cold. I tell myself it's some kind of animal, maybe a bear, but even that doesn't make sense. These tracks are wrong. The prints are long, almost like a wolf's, but far too large, and with claws that dig deep into the earth. I feel the eyes on me again. The forest is watching. I can't shake it. Something isn't right. The day drags on in tense silence. I hike further into the forest, but I can't escape the feeling that something is following me. Every time I stop, the trees seem to close in around me, whispering their secrets just beyond the edge of my hearing. At midday, I find the carvings. They're etched into the bark of several trees along the trail. Spirals, symbols I don't recognize. I touch the rough wood, tracing the marks with my fingers. There's a pattern, a deliberate design, but I can't tell what it means. Something ancient, something forgotten. I don't linger. My instincts are screaming at me to get out of here, to go back to the RV, but I push on. I came here to face my demons, to survive. I can't run now, but as the sun begins to set, I start hearing the whispers. They start soft, like the wind moving through the trees, but there's no wind. The voice rises and falls, just out of reach. My name. Ben. Ben. It's her voice. It sounds just like Sarah. My legs feel like lead as I move faster, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Ben! I break into a run. My chest burns as I sprint through the forest, the light fading fast. The shadows lengthen, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes around me. I can hear footsteps behind me now, heavy and deliberate. They're not mine. I don't stop until I reach the RV, slamming the door behind me, locking it twice for good measure. My lungs are heaving, and my skin prickles with cold sweat. I grab the knife I keep in the drawer, gripping it tight as I listen. Silence. Nothing but my ragged breathing and the low creak of the RV settling into the earth. But the feeling of being watched is stronger than ever. I move to the small window above the sink and peer out. That's when I see her. Sarah. She's standing in the clearing just beyond the trees, her silhouette bathed in the dim light of the moon. She's too far away for me to see her face, but I know it's her. I can feel it. Ben, she calls, her voice soft, pleading. But something's wrong. She's not moving. She just stands there, perfectly still. Too still. My breath catches in my throat. I step back from the window, heart pounding, the knife shaking in my hand. I squeeze my eyes shut, willing it to be a hallucination, a trick of my mind. When I open them again, she's gone. The night drags on in unbearable silence. Every creak, every rustle outside makes me jump. I don't sleep, can't. My mind races, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing fits. Sarah's dead. She's been dead for 3 years. There's no way that was her out there. But it looked like her, sounded like her. The next morning, I find more tracks around the RV. The same 2 large prints. Only now they lead away from the RV and disappear into the woods. I know I should leave. Every instinct in my body tells me to pack up, drive away, and never come back. But something else, some twisted sense of duty, pulls me deeper into the forest. I have to know. The day passes in a blur of tension. I follow the footprints, the strange symbols carved into trees becoming more frequent. The whispers are back, louder now, surrounding me. My head feels foggy, like I'm drifting between reality and some other place. By dusk, I find the clearing. It's eerily quiet. The trees seem to bend inwards, like they're trying to hide something. In the center of the clearing, there's a rock formation, ancient and jagged. The spirals and symbols are carved into the stones, glowing faintly in the dim light. And standing at the edge of the clearing is Sarah. This time she's closer. I can see her face, her eyes wide and hollow. She smiles, but it's not her smile. It's too wide, too unnatural. Ben, come closer. I freeze, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs feel rooted to the spot. I want to move, to run, but I can't. Something in the air holds me in place. She steps toward me, but her movements are jerky, unnatural, like she's being pulled by invisible strings. That's when I realize it's not her. It's never been her. The thing in front of me, it wears her face, but it's not her. Its eyes are wrong. Too dark, too empty. There's something behind those eyes, something ancient, malevolent. The Barilla. The name flashes through my mind, an old legend I'd heard in passing from the locals, a spirit, a shapeshifter, something that mimics the voices and faces of loved ones to lure you deeper into the forest. I clutch the knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. The creature steps closer, its smile widening into something grotesque, its eyes locked on mine. Ben, it whispers, its voice turning cold, rasping. It's your fault. The guilt hits me like a punch to the gut. My chest tightens, memories of Sarah flooding back. Her scream, her fall, my failure. No, I whisper, shaking my head. No, I tried. You failed. It hisses, its voice no longer Sarah's. You let her die. I can't breathe. The knife shakes in my hand. The creature is inches away now, its breath cold against my skin. You let her die. My grip tightens. A surge of anger and pain wells up inside me, stronger than the fear. I look into those empty eyes and see nothing but malice, nothing but the lie it's been feeding me. I scream, lunging forward with the knife. The blade slices through the air, and I feel it connect with something solid, something that screeches in pain. The creature reels back, its form flickering, shifting between shapes. Sarah, the wolf, something dark and twisted. Its scream fills the clearing, echoing off the trees. And then it's gone. I collapse to the ground, gasping for breath, my body shaking. The clearing is silent again, but the air feels lighter, like the forest has let out a long-held breath. I don't wait. I stumble back to the RV, bleeding and exhausted, and drive until the trees thin out, until I'm back on the main road, leaving Dark Hollow behind. I survived, but I know one thing for sure. Something is still watching, and it's waiting for the next person who dares to venture too deep into the cursed woods of Dark Hollow. I can still hear the wind rattling through the trees, the low hum of the forest at dusk. It's supposed to be peaceful out here, but something doesn't feel right. Not tonight. I came out to Freetown Fall River State Forest for some goddamn quiet, to clear my head and forget about everything that's been gnawing at me for months. Sam, the divorce, my entire life spiraling out of control. I needed this break. Just me, the RV, and a weekend of fishing. No phone, no emails, and definitely no reminders of Sam. I don't regret the split. Hell, I probably should have done it years ago. But something about the way she smiled when she signed the papers, that smug little look like she knew I'd end up miserable without her, stuck with me. Well, screw that. I'm better off on my own. The forest is thick here, dense with trees and shadows. It's one of those places where you can park an RV for days and not see another human. Perfect. That's what I told myself when I picked the spot. I needed to be alone. I needed space. And now, sitting by the fire, staring into the dark line of trees, I'm starting to wonder if I've made a mistake. It's just nerves, I tell myself. The sounds of the forest settling in for the night, the usual creaks and rustles of nature. I've camped in plenty of woods before. This is no different. Except it is. I've been out here 2 nights and the usual forest sounds are off. It's too quiet. I haven't seen any animals since I got here. No squirrels, no birds, nothing but that eerie wind that won't quit, always blowing through the trees but never quite touching the ground. The fire cracks, and I reach for the beer I set down next to my chair. Gone. Again. I stand up, looking around. I swear I put it right there, but the damn thing's missing. I toss my sleeping bag aside, kick through the dirt near the fire pit. Nothing. It's the 3rd time this has happened since I got here. First, it was my fishing gear. I'd left it by the stream, but when I went back the next morning, it was gone. Then, last night, my flashlight vanished. Now the beer. I'm sure it's me. It has to be. Maybe I'm getting forgetful. Maybe the stress has me all screwed up. Sam always said I was careless. Can't keep track of anything, Mark, she'd say, like she was so perfect. Whatever. It's just a beer. I glance at the tree line again. I've been feeling watched all day. Every time I step away from the fire to take a piss or grab some wood, I get this prickling sensation in the back of my neck. Like someone's there, just out of sight, watching. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but I can't shake it. A gust of wind blows through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I crouch by the fire, feeding it another log, and decide to call it a night. Tomorrow, I'll try fishing again. I'll stay focused. I head into the RV, locking the door behind me, and collapse on the small bed. It's cramped, but it beats sleeping on the ground. I lay there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the forest outside, trying to push the nagging feeling out of my head. It's nothing. You're alone. You wanted this. But the more I listen, the more I realize I'm not hearing just the wind anymore. There's something else, something faint, just beneath it. A soft, almost playful giggle. My heart skips. I sit up, straining to hear. The giggle comes again, this time clearer. It's coming from outside, just beyond the RV. It's the sound of a child laughing. Impossible. There are no kids out here. I force myself to breathe. It's late. I'm overtired. The mind plays tricks. I throw the blanket over my head, close my eyes tight, and will myself to sleep. The next morning, I wake to the sound of the wind howling again. I rub my eyes, feeling groggy and unsettled. Last night's laughter lingers in my mind, but I shake it off. It had to have been a dream. I step outside, feeling the cool morning air brush my skin. I half expect to find more of my stuff missing, but the RV looks untouched. Maybe I'm just overthinking things. Maybe all of this weirdness is in my head. Still, I can't shake that feeling. I set up my fishing rod, hoping the routine will ground me. I make my way down to the small stream I found yesterday, following the narrow path through the trees. That's when I see them. Footprints. Tiny, child-sized prints in the dirt, leading toward the stream. My skin crawls as I crouch down to inspect them. They're too small for an adult, but spaced far apart, like whoever, or whatever, made them was running. But there are no kids out here. No one has been near my camp. I would have heard them. I follow the prints along the trail until they disappear near the water's edge. Just gone. I stand there, staring at the empty bank, my pulse quickening. Okay, maybe it was a prank. Maybe there's some brat wandering around trying to mess with me. That's all it is. That's all it has to be. But the unease creeps back in as I head toward camp. The woods feel different, darker, like they're closing in on me. The wind has died down, but the air feels heavy, like it's watching. Back at the RV, I gather some wood for the fire and sit by the pit, trying to get my head straight. I was so excited to come out here. I wanted to prove I didn't need anyone, that I could be fine on my own. Now, I'm starting to wonder if being alone was the last thing I needed. As I sit by the fire, I notice something strange on one of the trees nearby. A marking carved deep into the bark. It's a spiral, rough and uneven, like it was scratched in with a dull blade. I frown, moving closer to inspect it. The spiral feels deliberate, not like something a kid would carve. The lines twist and turn in on themselves, growing smaller and tighter the closer to the center they get. Who would carve this? Why? The thought is interrupted by the sound of that giggling again. I freeze, my eyes darting to the edge of the clearing. There, between two trees, I catch a glimpse of movement. A shadow, small and quick, darting behind the trunk. My heart thuds in my chest. "Who's there?" I call out, my voice too shaky for my liking. I wait, but no one answers. Another giggle. This time, it sounds closer. My stomach drops. "Hey, enough with the games!" I grab my flashlight and head toward the trees, trying to convince myself this is just some dumb kid pulling a prank. But deep down, I know that's not right. The footprints, the carvings, they're wrong. All of it. I sweep the beam of the flashlight across the tree line, my breath quickening. The forest feels like it's holding its breath, waiting. Then I see it. A small figure, hunched over and peeking from behind a tree, its eyes gleaming in the fading light. It's no more than 3 feet tall, its skin pale and sickly, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. My breath catches in my throat. The thing stares at me, unblinking, its grin widening. Slowly, it raises one gnarled hand, beckoning me. Jesus. I stumble back, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolls across the ground, casting eerie shadows as I scramble away. When I look up again, it's gone. The trees are still, silent. My hands are shaking. I back up toward the RV, my mind racing. I'm not imagining this. There's something out here, something that's been watching me, playing with me. The Pukwudgie. The stories flash through my mind. I'd heard them in passing, dismissed them like any rational person would. Little creatures, mischievous tricksters from Wampanoag folklore. People claimed they lived in the Freetown Fall River forest, leading hikers astray, stealing their belongings, sometimes worse. I thought it was bullshit. But now I'm not so sure. I grab the knife I keep in the RV and lock myself inside. My heart won't stop racing. Every creak, every whisper outside makes me jump. I can't stay here. Not after that. I decide to pack up and leave first thing in the morning. I can't drive out now. It's too dark, and I'd never make it through the narrow forest roads in one piece. The night drags on, the air thick with tension. I don't sleep, just sit there in the dark, gripping the knife, listening. Then I hear it. A faint tapping on the side of the RV. Tap, tap, tap. I freeze, every muscle in my body tensing. The tapping continues, slow and deliberate, like someone or something is toying with me. Then comes the giggle, louder now, closer. It's right outside the door. I can't breathe. My hands tremble as I clutch the knife tighter. The tapping moves, circling the RV, like it's testing me, like it knows I'm trapped. Tap, tap, tap. I can't take it anymore. I throw open the door and lunge outside, the knife held high. But there's nothing. No one. Just the darkness, the endless trees, and the whisper of the wind. Suddenly, I hear the laugh again, high and mocking, coming from the trees. I run. I don't care where, I just run. The knife clutched in my hand, my breath ragged. The laughter follows me, echoing through the trees, taunting me. I don't know how long I run before I finally collapse, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. The forest around me is still, deathly quiet. I look up, and there, standing in the shadows, is the Pukwudgie, grinning, waiting. I stumble back, but I've gone too far. There's no way out. The creature steps closer, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. And then I realize it's been leading me here all along. I came to Ouachita for the quiet. That's what I always told myself. The kind of peace you only find when the world falls away and it's just you and the trees, the wind, and the sky. But standing here, with the sun disappearing behind the canopy of pines, I could feel it. The silence creeping in, wrapping around me like a second skin. It wasn't peaceful, though, not anymore. I'd parked my RV at the edge of the forest in a spot so remote it was miles from the nearest campground. I'd done it on purpose. After all, I'd been in far worse situations and I wasn't here for comfort. I was here to be alone, to think. I'd been running from a lot of things since I left the military. Old ghosts, the echoes of gunfire, screams that still rang in my ears at night. And Lindsay. I couldn't forget her. She tried to stay. I'll give her that. But there's only so long you can live with a man who won't let you in, who holds his silence like a shield. It's been years since we split, but her voice was still in my head. You need help, Eric. "You can't do this alone forever." She was wrong about that. I settled into the RV, unpacking my gear. The plan was simple: fishing, hiking, and sitting by the campfire with nothing but the crackle of wood to keep me company. I wasn't here to be haunted by memories. This trip was about getting away from them. The sun sank lower, and I found myself staring at the tree line. The forest had that ancient feel to it, like it had seen more than it let on. The pines stood tall and silent, their branches hanging heavy with something more than just the weight of years. I shook my head. Stop being ridiculous. I built a small fire and sat back in my chair, watching the flames flicker and dance. The crackle of burning wood usually put me at ease, but tonight the fire wasn't enough to push away the feeling that had settled in my gut. It was like someone had switched off the background noise of the world. No birds, no insects, just the wind whispering through the trees, and even that seemed muted. I heard it then, faint at first. Whispers, low, like they were being carried on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. I straightened in my chair, my senses alert. I wasn't alone. At least, it felt like I wasn't. I stood up, scanning the woods. Nothing. I sat back down, dismissing the sound as a trick of the mind. I'd been in the woods alone plenty of times. The silence, the isolation, it plays with your head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting for something to happen. The first real sign came that night. I woke up to footsteps outside the RV. Slow, deliberate, not animal footsteps, human ones. I listened, every muscle tensed, but the footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they'd started. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the dark. The forest was still. The air felt too cold for early autumn, my breath visible in the dim light. I scanned the area, looking for tracks, for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I shook my head. Probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Animals don't move like that. They don't linger at the edge of your camp, circling, waiting. I climbed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. My pulse was still pounding in my ears. I lay down, staring up at the ceiling, listening, waiting for the footsteps to return. They didn't, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I tried to shrug it off. A restless night wasn't going to ruin my trip. I spent the day hiking a trail that wound through the forest, my gear on my back, the smell of pine and damp earth in the air. The sun was warm on my face, but that strange coldness lingered, like a weight pressing down on the trees. As I reached the river, I set up my rod and cast into the clear, fast-moving water. The rhythm of it, the cast, the weight, usually calmed me, but not today. I couldn't focus. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me, though I knew there was no one out here. Then came the whispers again. Low, faint, but unmistakable. They were clearer this time, like a conversation just out of reach. I dropped my rod, whipping around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the riverbank was empty. My heart pounded. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding far too loud in the stillness. No answer, just the wind rustling the leaves. I packed up and headed back to the RV, cutting the day short. The feeling of being watched followed me all the way back to camp. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were closer, louder. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I stood at the window, gripping the curtain, staring out into the dark, but there was nothing. just shadows dancing in the firelight. When I woke the next morning, I found handprints on the windows, large, human-like, smeared across the glass. My stomach twisted. No one should have been out here. I was miles from the nearest town, the nearest campground. There shouldn't have been anyone near my camp in the middle of the night. It was starting to feel personal, like whatever was out there was waiting for me to crack. I wasn't about to give it the satisfaction. By the third night, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavier, colder, like the forest itself was pushing in on me. The fire barely seemed to keep the chill at bay, and no matter how many layers I wore, I couldn't get warm. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct. I could almost make out words now, though they were still too faint to understand. It was like the forest was talking, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what it had to say. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife in one hand, the other clenched into a fist. I wasn't scared, not of some stupid voices, but I was tired of the games, tired of the forest playing tricks on me. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until it felt like someone was standing just outside the ring of firelight. I stood, knife in hand, my breath coming fast, watching the shadows at the edge of the woods. And then I saw it. A figure. It stood just beyond the trees, tall and still, watching me. My pulse quickened. It wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just standing there. I stepped closer, my knife held tight. "Who are you?" My voice wavered more than I liked. The figure didn't answer. It didn't move. It just stared at me, though I couldn't make out its face. I took another step, and in that moment, it disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I backed away, the hairs on my neck standing up. This wasn't normal. I'd seen things, been through hell and back, but this was something else. I needed to leave, now. I packed up quickly, shoving my gear into the RV, hands trembling. The fire had gone out without me even noticing, and the cold was more intense than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the figure was still out there, watching. I climbed into the driver's seat, jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. Come on, I muttered, turning the key over and over. Still nothing. The RV refused to start, and with each failed attempt, the panic built in my chest. That's when I heard it. A voice. Clear, unmistakable. "Eric!" I froze, my hand still on the ignition. The voice was soft, almost familiar. Lindsay's voice, but that wasn't possible. I stepped outside, heart hammering in my chest. The cold hit me like a wall, and the shadows at the edge of the camp seemed to pulse, closing in. I could hear the whispers now, all around me, louder than ever. And then I saw them. Figures, more than one, standing among the trees, watching me. I stumbled back, knife still in hand, though it felt useless against whatever this was. My breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the air as I stared at the figures. And then one of them stepped forward, out of the shadows. I knew that face. I'd seen it 1,000 times in my dreams, in my nightmares. It was him, my best friend, the one I couldn't save. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but it was him. I knew it. He stood there, staring at me, silent, his expression a mix of sorrow and accusation. I sank to my knees, the knife falling from my hand. I couldn't breathe. The weight of his gaze crushed me, every ounce of guilt, of shame flooding back. I'd left him behind. I'd failed him. The whispers grew louder, deafening, but I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but kneel there, staring at the shadow of the man I used to know. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "I'm so sorry." The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching, waiting. When the sun finally rose, the figures were gone. The whispers had faded with the night, and the cold had lifted, but the weight in my chest remained. I gathered my things in silence, not daring to look back at the forest as I climbed into the RV. This time, the engine started on the first try. I drove away, the road winding through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving alone, that somewhere, just beyond the tree line, the shadows were still watching, still waiting, and no matter how far I drove, I'd never really be able to escape them. Not until I stopped running from myself. I wasn't running from anything. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I wound my way along the Blue Ridge Parkway, the golden light of early autumn casting long shadows across the road. The leaves had started to turn, brilliant reds and oranges lining the forest, stretching out for miles on either side of me. This trip was for me, to reconnect with nature, with my work. I had always found peace in the isolation of the wilderness, but now, as I steered my RV deeper into the heart of Shenandoah National Park, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I wasn't just here for the photography. I hadn't spoken to Diane in almost 2 years. We used to be close, inseparable even. She'd been the one who got me into hiking, into nature photography. But something shifted. She became overprotective, constantly warning me about the dangers of hiking alone, of going off-grid for days at a time. After one too many arguments, we just stopped talking. The silence between us weighed heavier than I cared to admit. Shenandoah had always been our place. The Blue Ridge Mountains, with their rolling fog and hidden overlooks, were like a sanctuary to me. Maybe that's why I'd chosen this spot. Somewhere, buried under the layers of unresolved tension, was the hope that coming here might give me some clarity, or at least a great set of photos for the blog. I pulled into a campsite near Stony Man Overlook, one of the quieter areas of the park. It wasn't well trafficked, which was exactly what I wanted. No noisy tourists, no distractions, just me, my camera, and the wilderness. After setting up my tripod and camera near the edge of the overlook, I settled into the familiar routine. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the trees below. The world stretched out before me in a perfect, serene stillness. I felt like I could breathe again. The tension that had knotted itself between my shoulders slowly began to unravel. But then I felt it. The prickling sensation that crawls up the back of your neck when someone's watching you. I straightened, glancing over my shoulder. There was no one around, just a dense wall of trees behind my RV. I stared into the woods, my breath held for a moment too long, waiting for something to move, for someone to step out from the shadows. Nothing. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Get a grip, Kate," I muttered to myself. I was alone, just as I wanted to be. I turned back to my camera, adjusting the settings for a few long exposure shots of the stars that would soon begin to appear. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. That night, I lay awake in the RV, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, an occasional twig snapping in the distance. I'd camped solo more times than I could count, and this was nothing new. Nature made noises. Animals moved in the night. Still, my stomach twisted with unease, my mind replaying every sound, every whisper of wind as if it were trying to tell me something. I got up, throwing on a jacket, and stepped outside to check my camera. The night air was crisp, the kind that bit at your cheeks. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like spilled salt. But as I approached the camera, something caught my eye. A dark shape on the horizon, standing against the backdrop of trees. It looked like a person. I froze, my pulse quickening. It was probably just another hiker. But at this hour, there were no other cars at the overlook when I'd arrived. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It was too still, too tall. I reached for my camera, zooming in on the shape, the lens capturing the silhouette standing perfectly still. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted the focus, waiting for the figure to come into clearer view. But just as the image sharpened, nothing. The shape was gone. I blinked, pulling the camera away from my face, scanning the horizon again. The trees stood there, silent, swaying gently in the wind. My heart was pounding in my chest, a dull, thudding rhythm that I couldn't calm. It was just your imagination, I told myself. It had to be. I packed up my equipment quickly and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. Inside, the space felt too small, too confining. I busied myself with organizing my photos, hoping that mundane task would distract me. But when I scrolled through the shots I'd taken, I froze. In one of the time lapses, just as the sun had dipped below the horizon, there was a figure. A tall, shadowy outline at the edge of the frame, standing just outside the tree line. It wasn't a trick of the light. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I'd come here to work, to photograph, and that's what I was going to do. The figure had to be another hiker or a trick of the landscape. But as I hiked further up the ridge to get some shots of the sunrise, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was following me. I kept stopping to listen, scanning the woods behind me. There were no footsteps, no movement, but the silence was wrong. I could hear the rustle of the wind, the distant chirp of birds, but there was an emptiness behind it, a void that swallowed sound. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on the back of my neck. I reached Stony Man just as the first light began to creep over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, but my camera felt heavier than usual, my movements slower. As I stood there, framing the shot, the feeling returned. The watcher. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line, and there, standing on the ridge across from me, was the figure again. Tall, motionless, watching. It was closer this time, close enough that I could make out the outline of a person, though it was obscured by the shadows of the trees. My chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. My first instinct was to call out, but something in my gut told me not to. It wasn't right. It wasn't human. I backed away slowly, my camera still in hand. The figure didn't move, didn't follow. It just stood there, its face hidden in the shadow, watching as I retreated. Back at the RV, I did what anyone would do. I turned to the internet. There were dozens of stories, accounts of people seeing things in the wilderness, strange figures, shadows that moved when no one was there. Some of them were tied to old Native American legends, spirits of the land, watchers that kept an eye on those who ventured too deep into their territory. And then I found it. The Dark Watchers. Appalachian folklore was full of tales about them. Mysterious, tall figures that appeared in the mountains, always at a distance, always watching. They never harmed anyone, but they never disappeared completely either. Those who saw them often reported a feeling of dread, an inexplicable sense of being hunted, though no one was ever physically attacked. I shut the laptop, trying to push the stories out of my mind. I was letting superstition get to me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a story. That night, the footsteps came again, louder this time, circling the RV. I stayed awake, every muscle tense, listening to the slow, deliberate crunch of leaves outside. My breath came shallow, ragged, and then, just before dawn, a voice. It wasn't loud, just a faint whisper carried on the wind, but it sounded familiar. Diane's voice. I bolted upright, heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't spoken to her in years. How could she be here? The voice came again, clearer this time, but just as distant. Kate! I stumbled out of the RV, eyes wide, scanning the fog-drenched landscape. No one. There was no one here. But the fog felt alive, like it was wrapping itself around me, closing in. And then I saw it. The figure, standing just beyond the clearing, closer than ever. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting. The sun had barely risen when I decided I couldn't stay here another night. I packed up quickly, hands trembling as I shoved gear into bags. The fog hadn't lifted, and the air felt thicker, colder. The figure was still out there, just out of sight, hidden in the mist. I could feel it. I started the RV, the engine sputtering to life. Relief flooded through me as I pulled away from the campsite, the road winding through the misty forest. But as I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was there, standing in the middle of the road, unmoving, watching me leave. Its face, or what passed for one, was a shadow, featureless, but the weight of its gaze pressed against my chest. I turned my eyes back to the road, refusing to look again, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I hadn't left it behind, that it would always be watching. Weeks later, back in the safety of my apartment, I finally looked at the last photo I'd taken at Stony Man. My stomach twisted as the image loaded on the screen. There it was, standing just behind me in the frame, its tall, shadowy figure blending into the fog. It had been closer than I'd realized, always just out of sight, watching. And now, even though I was miles away from Shenandoah, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, it was still watching me. The towering redwoods loomed overhead, their tops lost in the misty afternoon sky. I inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp, pine-scented air. This was what I had been craving, an escape from work, from people, from the grind. A weekend deep in the ancient forest with my girlfriend, Jenny, my best friend, Charlie, and my quiet co-worker, Nina. A perfect break, or so I thought. I set my pack down at the small clearing we'd decided would be our first campsite, right on the edge of Redwood National and State Parks. The trees seemed to close in around us, creating a natural barrier that swallowed sound and time. It was eerie in a way, how quiet the world felt here, but I brushed it off. This was nature's way of resetting the mind. "Rob, are you sure this is the right spot?" Jenny asked, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear as she scanned the area. "Yeah, definitely. We're close to Tall Trees Grove," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's just a bit more off the beaten path." Jenny raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. She knew I'd been planning this trip for weeks. We'd talked about the isolation, the beauty of being somewhere people rarely ventured. I could tell she wasn't entirely comfortable, though. Not that I could blame her. The redwoods, for all their majesty, were daunting. They felt like they were holding secrets, ancient ones. Charlie, ever the joker, started unpacking his gear and immediately complained. "Hey man, we've got a problem." He kicked the bent tent pole with a sigh. "Guess 2 of us are bunking together tonight." I laughed it off. "No big deal, we'll figure it out." Not a big deal. I was looking forward to some me time in the tent. Now I've got to share with Nina. I snore like a beast, Charlie teased, giving Nina a wink. Nina didn't laugh. She was always quiet, the type who preferred the company of books over people. She gave Charlie a small smile, but kept setting up her gear efficiently, clearly eager to get everything sorted before dark. As night fell, we built a fire and huddled around it, listening to the snap and crackle of the wood. The warmth was comforting against the growing chill in the air. Jenny, always the adventurous photographer, had her camera out, snapping pictures of the flames dancing against the backdrop of the towering trees. I watched her, the glow of the firelight reflecting in her eyes, but she seemed distracted. "You okay?" I asked. Jenny hesitated, lowering her camera. "Yeah, did you hear that?" Charlie groaned. "Oh, great. Here we go. Jenny's already hearing things." I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. It's probably just the wind. These trees are so tall, the wind echoes weirdly. Nothing to worry about. Jenny didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. We spent the next hour telling stories, laughing, and trying to shake off the tension that clung to the group. But it lingered, like a low hum beneath the noise of the forest. By the time we crawled into our tents, that feeling of being watched had settled deep in my bones. The first night was strange, though I didn't want to admit it at the time. Lying in the tent, I could hear the forest around us. But there was something more. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps that circled the campsite. Each time I tried to pinpoint the direction, they would stop. It was unnerving, but I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or some other harmless creature. Still, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, Jenny looked tired too. "I swear I saw someone out there last night," she said as we packed up. "Someone? Like another hiker?" I asked, trying to hide my concern. It was remote out here, sure, but not impossible that someone else might be around. Jenny shook her head. "No, it wasn't like that. It was just a shape standing at the edge of the trees. When I grabbed my camera to get a picture, it disappeared." "Probably a trick of the light," I said, although even I didn't believe it. The truth was, something had felt off since we'd arrived, like the forest was pressing down on us, suffocating in its silence. Nina was the next to speak, quietly, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment. "It could be the Dark Watchers." Charlie snorted. "The what?" Nina looked at him seriously, her eyes dark and reflective. "The Dark Watchers. They're an old legend around here. Figures that watch travelers from the hills. Sometimes they just stand there, observing. Other times, people who see them disappear." Jenny glanced at me, a little pale, but I waved it off. "Come on, Nina. Don't spook everyone, it's just a story." "It's not just a story," she insisted. "I read about them before we came here. People have been seeing them for centuries, long before California was even colonized." I sighed. "Okay, well, if we see any dark shadows, we'll let you know. But let's keep moving. Tall Trees Grove is supposed to be incredible." We packed up and hiked further into the dense forest. The trees grew taller, older, their bark rough and gnarled like they'd been standing for thousands of years. The deeper we went, the more isolated I felt. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor, casting everything in a dim, greenish haze. It wasn't long before we started noticing things that didn't make sense. Shadows seemed to move where there was no wind. Every time I looked behind us, I swore I saw something just on the edge of my vision. A figure, maybe? But when I turned, it was gone. Jenny snapped a few photos and showed me the camera's screen. There, in the distance, were faint outlines of figures standing far back among the trees. "You see them, right?" she asked quietly. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, but they're probably just tree shapes." Jenny didn't respond. I could tell she wasn't buying it anymore, and honestly, neither was I. That evening, we set up camp earlier than planned. No one wanted to keep walking. The forest had grown colder, darker, and the oppressive silence was getting to us all. As the sun set, the fog rolled in, creeping through the trees like fingers, swallowing everything in its path. Nina sat close to the fire, her eyes darting around nervously. "They're watching us." I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. The presence of something or someone just beyond our line of sight. Dark shapes flickered in and out of the mist, and the more I stared, the more it felt like they were moving closer. Charlie tried to laugh it off, but it was clear he was rattled. "All right, I think it's time to break out the whiskey. Nothing like a drink to chase away the spooks." But it didn't help. By midnight, we were all on edge. The watchers, or whatever they were, hadn't moved, but their presence was suffocating. I tried to convince myself it was just shadows, tricks of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The fire sputtered, and that's when Charlie snapped. "I can't do this, man," he said, standing up suddenly. "I'm done. I'm out of here." "Charlie, don't," I started, but it was too late. He grabbed his flashlight and bolted into the woods, his footsteps quickly swallowed by the thick fog. "Charlie!" I yelled, sprinting after him. I could hear his heavy breathing ahead, but as I ran deeper into the trees, the sound of his footsteps grew fainter until they stopped altogether. Panic set in as I slowed to a stop, my flashlight barely piercing the fog. I called out again and again, but there was no answer, just the eerie silence of the forest and the feeling that something was watching me. I turned, heart racing, and saw them, the dark watchers. They stood at the edge of the fog, tall and unmoving, their shapes barely distinguishable. But they were there watching me. I stumbled backward, the cold seeping into my bones as the figures grew closer. I ran. I ran back to camp as fast as I could, my breath ragged, my mind racing. When I burst into the clearing, Jenny and Nina were waiting, eyes wide with fear. "Did you find him?" Jenny asked, her voice shaking. I shook my head, gasping for air. "No, he's gone." Nina stood, staring out into the trees, her face pale. "We have to leave. Now." We didn't sleep that night. The watchers remained, always at the edge of the firelight, always watching. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. Every minute felt like an eternity. At dawn, we packed up silently, our faces drawn and tired. Charlie was gone, and we all knew it. We left the campsite and hiked back toward the trailhead, not daring to look back. As we reached the edge of the forest, the fog lifted and the watchers were gone. But I knew they were still out there, somewhere, waiting. I never told anyone what happened to Charlie. The authorities chalked it up to an accident, maybe a fall, or that he got lost. But I knew the truth. The Dark Watchers had taken him, just like they'd taken others before him. Jenny and I left the redwoods that day, but I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, the cold chill of knowing I'd been seen. And though I've tried to put it behind me, there's a part of me that wonders if the Dark Watchers will follow, if they're still watching, waiting for their next chance to appear. And when they do, I won't be so lucky.